The next important cycle to discuss is the phosphorus cycle. Like nitrogen, phosphorus is usually a limiting reagent for plant growth. So this is going to be one of the nutrients in the soil that's going to be the main determiner about how much plants are actually going to be capable of growing in a given area, because as soon as phosphorus becomes available, it's going to be scooped up by the plants because that's how much they need phosphorus. Phosphorus is a really important component for cell membranes, so all organisms are made out of cells, and every cell is surrounded by an oily layer called the cell membrane, and cell membranes are made out of these molecules called phospholipids, and each phospholipid has a phosphorus atom involved in it. So you need lots and lots and lots of these phosphorus atoms, a lot of these phosphorus elements, these phosphate molecules, in order to make your cell membranes. It also is vitally important for your DNA. The backbone of your DNA, its structure, is built partially from phosphorus molecules. So it's a pretty important element for all life on Earth. Now, one of the big differences between the phosphorus cycle and all the other biogeochemical cycles we're going to talk about is that there is no atmosphere component of the phosphorus cycle. The carbon cycle, right, it involved photosynthesis and cellular respiration, both of which involved exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen with the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle involved taking N2 from the atmosphere and fixing it with a nitrogen-fixing bacteria into the nitrates in the soil. The hydrologic cycle involved evaporation and precipitation, exchanging water vapor with the atmosphere and bringing it back down to Earth. The phosphorus cycle has no atmospheric component whatsoever. And that's part of why phosphorus is such a limiting reagent for most ecosystems. If it can't spread and mix itself in the atmosphere, then it can't really be evenly distributed across all ecosystems. So most of the time, in order to get phosphorus, plants have to wait for decomposers to return detritus, decaying matter, animal carcasses, and wastes back to the soil to unlock some of that phosphorus and make it available to them to be able to use again. New phosphorus only re-enters the ecosystem when there's a large rain event and a bunch of phosphorus comes in through a floodplain, and you'll see why that is in just a moment. So if the phosphorus isn't held in the atmosphere, where is it being stored? It's being stored in rocks, in rocks up in mountains. So here I have a picture of a big rocky mountain, and you can see that there's lots of little bits and pieces of broken rock on the mountainside, and that's as a result of something we call weathering. As rain falls on a mountainside, it slowly but surely has this effect of being able to dissolve away materials. Water is really, really good at being able to interact with other types of chemicals. It's what we call the universal solvent. It's really good at being able to dissolve things away and break them down a little bit. So as water moves over a surface, it picks up little microscopic pieces of whatever it's interacting with and slowly erodes it away, slowly breaks it down, and that creates little cracks and crevices as it goes. Now, as you get these little cracks and crevices, when the water flows into those, it will create a little puddle in there, it'll fill it up, and when winter comes through, ice will form, and when water freezes, it expands. So you have a little crack, water fills up that crack, and then it expands, and that actually makes the crack bigger, right? So the water acts as a wedge and then opens up that crack even further. And this breaks the rock into smaller pieces, right? You're getting more and more of these cracks starting to show up. So through both chemical and physical processes, the process of rain falling on a mountainside will slowly break down all of the rocks on that mountainside into smaller and smaller tiny little pieces. And as the rain flows down the mountain to the ecosystems that are below, it's going to pick up little bits of the chemicals that make up those rocks, including the phosphates, including the phosphorus atoms that are hidden inside those rocks. Biological processes can actually accelerate this a little bit. So this is something called a lichen here on the right. A lichen is not an algae, and it's not a fungus. It's a symbiotic cooperation between those two different kinds of organisms. It's a combination of both kinds of cells working together. And lichens have the ability to grow on bare rock and get nutrients like phosphates directly out of that rock. And they excrete waste as they go, as all living things do. And those wastes are somewhat acidic, and they help accelerate this process of weathering the rock. But lichens, when they finish their lifespan, they leave behind a little bit of organic material. And so what we have are progressively smaller and smaller pieces of rock getting into tiny little pebbles and sand and silt and clay, right? The smaller a piece of rock you get, the more we're getting into things like sand and silt and clay. And we're mixing in a little bit of organic matter. And this is how soils begin to form, something, again, we'll talk about a little bit later on. So the important part for the phosphorus cycle right now is that we have these big mountains, which are reservoirs of phosphorus ions. And rain will fall on these mountains, and it will carry those phosphorus ions downhill through the process of weathering. On the following slide, we have the steps of the phosphorus cycle. So here's the steps that you want to know. And on the top, I have all these phosphate ions. This is what phosphate ions actually look like. Number 1, water weathers away rocks that contain phosphate ions. So rain falls on mountaintops, and the phosphate ions in those rocks are unlocked, and they are carried through the water downhill into floodplains below. These ions are carried into the soil, where they can be absorbed by producers, plants and algae and things like that. So you get this fresh influx of nutrients coming into the ecosystems in the floodplains. Phosphate compounds are then transferred by food webs to consumers and then finally to decomposers, because obviously the consumers create waste, the plant life leaves leaf litter and detritus around. Detritus is anything dead that's sitting on the ecosystem floor, and the decomposers return that detritus to the inorganic nutrients, the non-living abiotic nutrients that new producers can then use to build their own biomass back up again. They can use it as primary components of production. Number 4, phosphate eventually can be washed away to the sea floor, where it stays until geological processes expose these deposits millions of years later. Now that part sounds pretty wild. So in order to understand this component of the phosphorus cycle, think about it like this. You have this mountain, which is your reservoir of phosphorus, and as water runs over it, it's delivering new phosphorus to the ecosystems below, and that phosphorus is getting passed around, but sometimes we lose the phosphorus, it just kind of washes away to the ocean floor, and it disappears, right? But that's okay, we have new phosphorus coming from the mountain. But that process of weathering is slowly eroding away that mountain. All of the little bits of material, the little bits of rock, are slowly being washed away down into that floodplain below. So the mountain is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as this process of erosion continues over millions of years. And eventually, that mountain will be eroded away. At that point, how would we get new phosphorus into ecosystems if there's no more mountain in order to erode new phosphorus from the rocks in order to get into the floodplain? Well, we would need to make new mountains. And the way mountains form is through plate tectonics and long-term geological processes. So because the phosphorus cycle does not have an atmospheric component, it relies on long-term, and I mean millions and millions of years, long-term geological processes related to the uplifting of mountains, followed by their slow, steady erosion over an even longer period of time. And that phosphorus that eventually washes away onto the ocean floor, well, the ocean floor is part of these tectonic plates as well, and part of it will be It's called subduction when one tectonic plate goes underneath another, and it's going to be part of the overall recycling of geological material that occurs in the Earth's crust. New mountains, meanwhile, will form when two tectonic plates butt into each other and then force each other to uplift, creating a new high point in the landscape, a new mountain range, or possibly through volcanic activity. Either way, once you have a new mountain, you can begin the process of weathering and erosion again, and the phosphate ions that are trapped inside that mountain, in the rocks of that mountain, will end up flowing downstream. So let's take a look at the diagram that the book provides. At step number 1, it notes that phosphates, which were in the rocks, are now available. We're down here in a floodplain, and they're going to be taken up by the plants. So the phosphates are in the soil, inorganic phosphates. They're not part of a biological system yet, and they're going to be assimilated by the plants. I mean, they're going to be absorbed by the plant roots. They're going to be used in building the plant materials. Those plants, producers, are going to be eaten by consumers. Primary consumers are herbivores, the ones that eat the plants, and then secondary consumers are omnivores and carnivores. I've mentioned this idea before. Those plants and animals are going to leave waste behind, leaf litter and feces and things like that, but they'll also leave carcasses and dead plant material behind. All of that is detritus, dead material, that will be taken by the decomposers, fungi and bacteria, returned to the soil. This part should seem really, really familiar at this point. The decomposers have the job of decomposition, which returns the phosphates back to the soil. Now, like I said, phosphates are a limiting reagent. They are really, really in demand in an ecosystem. So as soon as phosphates become available, they're going to be snapped up by the plants in that ecosystem, and they're going to be reassimilated immediately. And so phosphate doesn't really sit in the soil for very long. So a single phosphorus atom could end up going through this biological cycle of going from the soil to the plants to the animals to the decomposers to the soil to the plants to the animals to the decomposers, round and round and round and round for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, because as soon as it becomes available, it's going to get snapped back up again. But at some point, it will be in the soil, and there's a chance that it will get eroded away or get picked up by surface runoff of water and end up in a river, a stream, and move out into the ocean, where it'll be deposited on the ocean floor. And that molecule of phosphate will essentially become lost to ecosystems until it becomes available again through some long-term geological process. New phosphates become available when uplifting of rock creates new mountain ranges, which then can begin the process of weathering and erosion over again, which then delivers new phosphates to floodplains below, to ecosystems below. And then it's the plants and animals that are able to take that phosphate and kind of spread them to other ecosystems. And so the cycle continues on and on and on. So how do humans affect the phosphorus cycle? Well, one thing that we do is, much like with the nitrogen cycle, we create artificial phosphate fertilizers. And we apply them anywhere where we need extra plant growth. So we apply them on farms. We also apply them on golf courses because we want them to be extra green. We apply them on residential lawns. We apply them kind of all over the place. And these artificial fertilizers are usually some sort of like liquid spray that you can put out. It's not tied up with organic material in the leaf litter or in the soil itself. So it's much easier for it to just be sort of washed out of the soil when rain comes through. And I've mentioned this idea before that all of the landscape that is part of a single watershed, any fertilizer or herbicide or pesticide that's used in that watershed is going to be funneled to the same aquatic ecosystem. But I haven't shown you this yet. Take a look at this map. All of these watersheds in the American Midwest are actually connected to a single watershed. These are all eventually connected to the Mississippi watershed. And if you look at this area, this is the breadbasket of America. This is where the majority of our agricultural production occurs. So think about all of those farms and all of the artificial fertilizer that we use on all of that cropland. Not only does it get channeled into the local streams and rivers, but because these are all connected to each other, all of that fertilizer eventually ends up going into the Mississippi River, and then it all gets funneled directly into the Gulf of Mexico. And as I mentioned before, when you have this giant influx of nutrients, the fastest growing producer in an aquatic ecosystem are going to be your algae, these single-celled photosynthetic organisms. And they're going to have these blooms. They're just going to divide like crazy, and you're just going to have this big sea of green muck all over the place. And they divide very, very, very quickly, but they do not have very long lifespans, so they eventually die. And what happens when organisms and ecosystems die? The decomposers have to break them down. Decomposers use cellular respiration in order to get energy from the materials that they're breaking down, just like we use cellular respiration in order to get energy from the food we eat. Cellular respiration requires oxygen. So in order to break down this massive bloom of algae, the decomposers need to use up all of the dissolved oxygen that's inside the water column. So if there's no oxygen left in the water, the fish in the Gulf of Mexico have nothing to breathe. So every year we have these massive dead zones that pop up in the Gulf of Mexico. Sections where the dissolved oxygen has been depleted so much that the fish have had nothing to breathe, so you just have lots and lots and lots of dead fish washing up on shore all over the place, usually in water that is full of just kind of green muck at the same time. And it's as a result of all of the artificial fertilizers that we use on all of our farms. There's a good vocabulary word on this slide. It says eutrophication. When an aquatic ecosystem becomes overwhelmed with nutrients and you get these big blooms of algae, we call it a eutrophic aquatic ecosystem. And the process by which that happens is a eutrophication. And when it happens as a result of human conduct, it's called cultural eutrophication. When I first heard about this concept, I thought it was just so weird to talk about nutrient pollution, right? Because nutrients are good. How can you have too many nutrients in an ecosystem? But just like it's possible to take a toxic amount of certain vitamins and minerals, it is possible to overload an ecosystem with too many nutrients, too much of a good thing. Now, the use of artificial fertilizers like nitrates and phosphates has dramatically increased the amount of food that humans are capable of growing on Earth, and has allowed us to feed far more people than we otherwise ever would have been able to. So they have been a net good for humanity. But that doesn't erase the fact that there are negative consequences to their overuse. So when I talk about the environmental consequences of certain types of decisions, these are the kinds of costs and factors that are part of that decision-making process. Being aware of these sorts of consequences allows us to consider whether or not there might be options for using these technologies that are perhaps less environmentally harmful, but still allows us to gain most of the benefits from their application.